I'm sure everybody in this room has heard of Abraham Lincoln's definition of democracy, which is government of the people, by the people, and for the people. In order to preserve his definition, it is essential that every citizen in the United States over the age of 18 has the right to vote. Pennsylvania is attempting to pass a voter identification law which would not allow a registered voter to vote if they do not show a valid photo identification at the polls. Examples of acceptable identification would include a driver's license and a passport, and these cannot be expired. The problems which include the fact that not every citizen has a valid photo identification card far exceeds the benefits, which is why I'm going to persuade you to help this law from ever taking effect. Many politicians and supporters claim that the voter identification law is necessary in Pennsylvania because the law would decrease in-person voter fraud. The fact of the matter, however, is that in-person voter fraud is not a problem in Pennsylvania. According to an article published in 2012 by Jamel Bowie of the Washington Post, the state signed a stipulation admitting that there have not been any investigations or prosecutions of in-person voter fraud in Pennsylvania. Furthermore, the parties involved do not have direct knowledge of investigations or prosecutions of in-person voter fraud in any other state. Clearly, in-person voter fraud is not a problem in Pennsylvania, so this claim holds very little, if any, weight. Supporters of this law taking effect commonly cite that identification is required for many activities people commonly participate in, and that voting should just be another activity that requires ID. An article written in 2012 by Hans Spazowski of usnews.com states that ID is required to drive a car or buy beer, and that voting should not be any different. The problem is that voting is different, but unlike buying beer or driving a car, voting is not a privilege. It is a right inherent in the concept of democracy. In addition, a person's identification is confirmed when they register to vote, so there is no need to confirm a person's identity when they go to vote. Now that I've discussed two of the most common claims for the need of a voter identification law in Pennsylvania, I'm going to discuss the problems that would occur if the law is passed. A voter identification law is being passed in the state would not have effect of many citizens, in particular minorities and the elderly. Minorities disproportionately lack valid identification in PA, according to an article written in 2012 by Ben Jealous of the Huffington Post. 186,000 registered voters in Pennsylvania, which makes up about 18% of registered voters in the city, lacked proper identification to vote in the 2012 presidential election. Philadelphia is the largest minority population in Pennsylvania, making this a good indication that voter ID law should have a big impact on minorities. Nationally, 25% of African Americans and 16% of Hispanics did not have the documents required to obtain a photo identification for voter identification laws in 2012. As stated in the same article, like minorities, the elderly population would be disproportionately affected by the voter identification law in Pennsylvania. An article written in 2012 by Scott Krause, Eugene Tober, and John Mysick of the Morning Call said that 13 southeastern Pennsylvania counties, 15% of the registered voters are 65 and older, did not have some form of identification. The same article said Ernie Geisenheimer, an 80-year-old Korean War era Navy vet and Pennsylvania resident, has military ID, but voter ID law did not allow him to use this to vote because it did not have his photo. Like many seniors, Mr. Geisenheimer no longer drives, so he does not have an unexpired driver's license. Clearly, if a voter identification law is passed in Pennsylvania, minorities and the elderly would have less of an impact on elections, and as a result, their needs may not get met, as well as everybody else that lacks a photo identification. There is a solution. Democracy and the right to vote can be preserved by banning a voter identification law in Pennsylvania. Without a voter identification law, 758,000 registered voters in Pennsylvania were able to vote in the 2012 presidential election. This equivalent to about 6 times the population of Allentown and half of the population of Philadelphia. In an article written in 2012 by Dave Boyer of the Washington Times, they lacked photo identification. If these registered voters were denied their right to vote, their voice would not have been heard. And as a result of the election, it could have been different. Imagine if every election, if 9% of votes were not counted. Clearly, that would not fit Abraham Lincoln's definition of democracy that I mentioned earlier. After hearing problems with the voter identification law in Pennsylvania, I encourage everyone to help make sure and registered voters were able to vote in the 2016 presidential election and every election to follow by writing their state senator to their respective districts to ban the voter identification law from ever taking effect in Pennsylvania. You can easily identify your representative state senator and obtain their contact information by visiting www.pasen.gov. Meanwhile, if you are asked to show your identification while at the polls, I encourage each of you just to refuse to show your identification. Since it is not a law yet, together, let's preserve democracy.